Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and my guest today is James Lancaster, Managing Director of Alderney Electricity. And we're going to look at the use of steam in electricity generation, and also consult the crystal ball as to what's going to happen in the future. James, good to see you.
Good to see you, Tony. Brought to you by the powers of the interweb.
Yeah, absolutely. But, you know, I think as long as we get the points across, that'll be okay. I mean, essentially, what we're going to do this afternoon is look at the past, forget the present, and look at the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And of course, you know, I mentioned steam earlier, and being a school child, a schoolboy at heart, I have a love for anything steam, and locomotives, traction engines, etc. But you know, it was and still is currently the way that it pushes those generator spindles around.
Yeah, there is still a lot of steam generation. Nuclear power plants, I mean, they ultimately are steam powered. Your nuclear pile heats water, which produces steam that drives steam turbines. So yeah, it seems very old tech at some level, but is very, very topical and very current.
In the case of nuclear, the water is contained, isn't it? It's just a sort of continuous circuit.
Yeah, exactly so. Yeah.
You know,
because of all of the various contamination issues that people might be worried about, you actually do operate within a closed circuit. I mean, in fact, most things do now. So if you think about again the cooling systems that you find on your car or otherwise, those are all you know, closed circuit, and they work perfectly well in those kinds of environments.
Yeah. Of course, pre-nuclear, we had coal and oil, as you know, literally burning that to make the heat. And
yes.
Sorry, James, and then we go on to gas steam turbines.
Yeah, the sort of the combined cycle turbines that you're seeing nowadays. So the analogy there is that if you just take a gas turbine, so lots of gas turbines are used for generation purposes, have been used for very many years now. The gas turbine is actually a mechanically relatively simple engine, and so from a reliability point of view and you know, a maintenance point of view, actually they're quite good power units.
It's basically
and yeah, I mean, it's just a spindle and a couple of bearings, really, with lots of mounted on it, and a combustion chamber. But you know, obviously, gas, instead of just blowing air, gas turbines turn and therefore are quite capable of powering a generator, which they do, and they've been using those for years. But in common with most fossil fuel-based engines, they are relatively inefficient. So the efficiency that you get off a gas turbine is going to be in the order of 30 to 40%, the same as you would off of a diesel engine. So where the benefits really arrive is that the air, the exhaust from a gas turbine is obviously very, very hot indeed. It's very high grade heat and it's very usable. And so what you then do is you take the exhaust from your gas turbine, heat water with it to produce steam, and then drive a steam turbine. And that pumps the overall efficiency up from the mid-30s up to between 55, 60%, something like that. So modern so-called combined cycle, which is the steam cycle and a gas turbine cycle, generators are very, very efficient.
James, essentially, it's like an aircraft jet engine, isn't it?
Yeah, the gas turbine is just a jet engine.
Yeah.
But instead of blowing air for propulsion, you actually you use the rotating force on the cylinder to power a generator. That's what it does.
Now, I had a look through the old internet, and there was a plan to put a gas station in, turbine presumably, with Drax.
Yeah.
Is that still on, or?
Yeah, no. As far as I'm aware, that's still going ahead. So Drax is the largest, I think, in terms of its operational components, is still the UK's largest power station. Knocks out about somewhere between 3.5 and 4 megawatts when it's running flat out. Was originally all coal fired, but some years ago, and I'm going to, off the top of my head here, I'm going to say 2010, something like that. So sometime in the last decade or so, a number of the coal burning cells were converted to biomass.
Yeah.
And so they've been importing wood chip, which they burn at Drax to produce power. But at the same time, they still were burning some coal alongside of that. But they've now taken the decision that what they will do is, instead of continuing to, they're going to swap the remaining coal sections of the power station over to these combined cycle gas turbine generators.
And obviously, based on those efficiency figures that you gave us just now, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, with gas turbines, I mean, it depends what they do, but all you need is an inflammable gas to power the things. So you can run them on a whole variety of things, and you can, in theory, run gas turbine engines on renewable fuels. So if you're making sort of methane or otherwise, you can actually run a gas turbine on that.
And we've seen that recently with that space rocket that was launched from Maine using biofuel.
Biofuels, yeah. I think when we talk about renewable energy, there is always a tendency to sort of focus on solar panels and wind turbines, or in Alderney's case, focus on tidal potentially. Yeah. But the reality is that renewable is a broad church, and as long as you are using renewable feedstocks, then biomass generators are obviously renewable energy forms. And as long as you are using short, so part of the problem comes, and in fact, Drax ran into a bit of a political storm a few years back when it was discovered that the wood chips that they were importing from America, some of those were coming out of deciduous forests as well as the coniferous forest. And people then started to scratch their head and say, well, hang on a minute, how renewable is this? Because we're talking about wood chips coming from trees that you can't replace them quickly. They grow over a long period of time. Yes, they can be managed in such a way that they can deliver replaceable stocks, but what you don't want to do is you don't want to be chopping down oak trees to make wood pellets. And so there were all sorts of questions asked about actually how renewable were these sources. And by the time you stuck it on a ship powered by diesel and transported it across the Atlantic, well, exactly, it just was starting to look not very renewable at all, really. So sorry for the clattering and banging. I'm sat at a table here, and my watch and ring are bashing on the top of the table. If anybody can hear unpleasant clashes and bangs, that's me. I'll try and stop doing it. But it does, it begs this question: how renewable is my renewable technology? And actually, what can we put up with, or what we are prepared to put up with as communities during transition?
Yeah,
because as you transition from one state to another, you're quite often not going to go from wholly non-renewable to wholly renewable in one step. and sometimes the intermediate steps that you have to make are actually more costly in the environment than they would be otherwise, or more costly economically than they would be otherwise. But nonetheless, you need to go through that in order to come out to a better future at the far end.
Question is though, who
and
pays for it?
Makes, well, that's the case. There has been relatively close to home for people on Alderney. There has been a lot of interest in showing what's going on in Sark. Now, the community, not surprisingly, were struggling with the price of energy in Sark, which had peaked. I think at one point the price got up to over 80 pence a kilowatt hour. So that's double, the peak price that we've seen on Alderney. So electricity was very expensive indeed. And the community decided to take a legislative approach and appointed a regulator. Now, the regulator has been working with the government and Sark and the electricity company over there. But what they have realised is that the cheapest place to be economically is either at the beginning or at the end of the transition process.
Yeah.
So at the moment they have got a conventional centralized generating system, and they distribute power to the houses on the island. But at the price that electricity is, you can do the maths. You can say, well, actually, as long as you can afford it, you can take yourself off grid, wholly off grid, and deliver yourself cheaper energy than you get from buying it. And that's largely, in the case of Sark, it's because of the scale of the community and the scale of the economy. However, if you were to say, all right, well, that's fine, we're actually going to do away with the electricity grid, and we're going to, I'm not talking about Sark now, that's their own choices, but hypothetically, if you were to move to a point where you had a wholly distributed energy system where people were generating their own electricity, there may be benefits at the far end. But what happens when only half of the community is off grid? Well, actually, it's at that point, it's more expensive for everybody. And so you do need to think about how you fund transition. Because in the first instance, as you move through transition, actually, there is almost no intermediate position, which is not more costly, either from an environmental point of view or from an economic point of view, than you would find at either end of at the end of that transition curve. And that's a real challenge. But then that brings us back to the conversation that we were having last time around energy policy and why it's absolutely essential for communities, governments, nations to have energy policies that take into account all of these variable effects that happen over time.
Now, looking at the UK government, they're saying after 2030 there to be no more cars to be manufactured with internal combustion engines. I think a lot of people, quite honestly, are going to take the view that by 2027, 28, they won't buy that sort of car in any case. So you're suddenly getting into a situation where there's going to be pent-up demand on the electricity supply system. But as you know, at the moment, the UK government give a rebate of, I think it's £3,000 or something like that, to somebody buying an electric car. And in addition to that, I don't think they have to pay road tax. So that is a whole financial hole that's got to be filled.
Yeah. So electric vehicles in the UK at the moment, if you have an electric vehicle, as you say, there is a government grant, which is just a grant, which is of the order of, it is £3,000, you're right, which just goes towards the cost of that car.
Yeah.
The road fund price, which is your road tax, that's 0 rated for electric vehicles. Also, if you've got a company vehicle, the benefit in kind tax is 0.
So there's going to be a tipping point here where they suddenly sort of say, well, we've got, 50% electric or even more than that. And they're going to say, well, how do we make up for the deficit that we're carrying by not charging road tax, by giving a grant and giving companies tax relief? So, it's a financial hole.
Well, it is. I think it is all about the actions that the government needs to take in order to achieve what they consider to be desirable outcomes in the long run.
Yeah.
So, and presumably someone somewhere in the in the Treasury working for the Chancellor will have run the numbers and said, well, that's fine. But if we want to achieve this, yes, it's going to cost us money in subsidies in the short term, but in the long term, we're better off. And these are the calculations that we all need to make.
I mean, by 2040, presumably, it's going to be virtually all electric as far as vehicles are concerned.
So that's the huge crystal ball. It's those people who follow these things may have noticed that in amongst the government's the UK government's announcements just recently is that gas boilers are all to be phased out.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that there will be, there will be no new gas installations from a particular date, and that all gas boilers need to be phased out by 2030 or whatever the date is. There's so much of this information, flying around, and so many of these statements coming out that it's difficult to sort of keep tabs on all of it, really. But immediately, the people on sort of inside of the industry say, well, that's all well and good, but who's actually going to pay to convert all of these boilers to a more acceptable form, presumably some form of electrical
or hydrogen
or electrical boilers, as we discussed previously.
Yeah.
Firstly, not all properties out there are suitable for that kind of conversion, and secondly, even so, there is a huge capital cost that the government are now expecting somebody to foot over the next decade to replace millions and millions of gas boilers.
Yeah.
And so it's very easy on one hand for the government to actually say we're going to do these things. Whether they come to pass or not is the big question.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, the other thing is presumably with electricity consumption going up by at least 50%, can you produce it? Can you distribute it?
Yeah, I mean, again, all valid questions. It's, I mean, if you come back to the case of Alderney, if we were to take Alderney and convert it to all electric, you would look at the demand would double, pretty much, assuming that you were putting in kinds of efficient systems which would make a very good use of the electricity by comparison to the kind of efficiencies that you get out of kerosene boilers. I mean, we've touched on these topics in our conversations previously, Tony.
Absolutely, yeah.
But if you were to double the demand on the electricity grid tomorrow, there are certain parts of the grid on the island, particularly in the town area, as it happens, where the grid would fall over because we do not have capacity in the last 50 yards of the low voltage distribution system to cope with it. And the same is true in the UK. So it's true all over.
And what about that? The wiring in the actual houses themselves? Would you have to upgrade there?
I mean, you would, but if you were putting, let's say you were. Okay, so a typical gas boiler is going to be what? 20, 25 kilowatts, something like that.
Yeah.
Now you wouldn't necessarily need if you had an advanced electrical heater, an air pump or something like that. It wouldn't necessarily have to be 20, 25 kilowatts, but it might be 10 kilowatts. You could not just, wherever you are, you would struggle if you were suddenly going to plug an additional 10 kilowatt load into the existing electrical system. But of course, in terms of the domestic wiring or otherwise, that's not so much of a problem because you would simply run a new internal cable to feed, or you put a new feed in specifically for that device.
Yeah, okay.
And so the real pinch point is not within the home. I mean, yeah, there's a cost to doing that, but it's a simple mod. The pinch point is on the cable that lies between the home and the first distribution point on the network, because that's the bit that's going to be expensive to upgrade, because that's carrying all of the load.
Yeah.
And it's probably not rated with that much head. It's probably not going to be rated with that much headroom.
Yeah, so that, you know, all of this
That makes
business
sense?
about, yeah, it does make sense. But I mean, it brings me back to the point that all of these ideas, they're great in theory, but the cost is going to be tremendous to governments and to individuals. And, you know, possibly 50 years from now, you know, everything will have been absorbed. But the interim period is going to be very, very difficult, I think.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the you know, government intervention at this level has historically to be subsidising the cost of new technologies,
Yeah.
up to a point where normal market economics takes over, and the volumes of those new technologies rise to a point where the cost comes down to a level that is considered affordable. That's absolutely fine in terms of new technologies like solar and wind and otherwise. But the reality is, with something like somebody's boiler in their house, you're still going, you know, even if you can get the price of a new a boiler designed around a new technology, let's say when it's first introduced, it's 20,000. By the time that the volume effect has kicked in, all right, the price might have come down to be comparable with an oil-fired boiler, but you're still perhaps looking at 3 or 4 grand. At which point, you know, somebody's still got to find that money, and that's a lot of money for somebody to foot the bill for.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Especially if they have no choice.
But
so yeah, so you know,
you tend to
these are the
sorry.
No, it's all right. It's the ones of Zoom, because of course we're not in the same room. There's this slight lag, isn't there, all the time?
Something like that.
But these are the challenges that need to be worked through, and which nobody has managed to get their head around. And it's nobody's fault, and it's not surprisingly, but these are the real challenges that the government can only do so much to influence market economics. If you, sooner or later, if you want to make a wholesale transition from one technology, so as you say, in the UK, phasing out gas boilers by 2030, somebody needs to fund that transition. Somebody needs to find the money to pay for all of these new boilers, which are going to replace all the gas and oil boilers that are currently out there. And it is a bit of a stretch to ask landlords to foot the bill for it. It's a bit of a stretch to ask people on low incomes to foot the bill for it. You know, fine, yeah, if you've got the odd five grand sat in the bank account that's not earning any interest on your savings at the moment, well, perhaps it's not too much of a hardship. But that's the majority of people, you know, don't find themselves in that fortunate position. And those are the challenges which really have to be addressed. The challenge of climate change has got relatively little to do with technology in the long run. It's actually about the economics of it as it applies to those people who just don't happen to have money sat around to do these things. How do you get those over you know, how do you help those people?
I suppose probably it's an immense problem, but I suppose you may well find the fact that the government might have to make soft loans to people.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to the people who have been active within climate change, the climate change agenda for last couple of decades now, you know, without, and I'm not necessarily talking about those people who are activists and who are, you know, paying the table or thumping the table or demanding change or otherwise, people who are quite sanguine about it, who are just looking at the challenges and trying to assess what would be involved. You will often find people talking about economies having to take what is effectively an enforced recession in order to be able to meet the costs.
Yeah.
And that's no different from the enforced, if you like, the enforced, almost voluntary recession that economies are having to go through at the moment to deal with COVID.
That's right. And of course, when they came out with all these ideas, they never thought for one moment they'd have COVID to contend with, and create a situation where the UK is in massive debt. I mean, the only consolation there, of course, is the fact that interest rates are low.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely right. But we're talking the same thing actually. COVID has come along with a massive and important impact that just cannot be avoided. It needed to be dealt with. And the only way to deal with it was actually, at some level, to throw money at it. And so the governments globally have put their hand in their pocket, but will doubtless be scratching their heads around how the hell we're going to pay for that.
Yeah, it's not so much a money tree; it's a money forest required.
Well, it's a money forest, and actually, and I think that it's the salient point here is that actually climate change at the scale that people are envisaging is no different. All right, it's not an impact that has happened within a space of months or a year, but a decade isn't that much longer.
No, that's right. It's very short, actually, and it's going to be quite interesting to see what they come up with at the Glasgow conference later this year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In November, that's going to be fascinating.
Yeah. So we'll just have to wait and see. James, we've got to the point where we've run out of time. But again, the story of our lives. But thank you so much for sparing us some time. Hopefully we'll be able to have a chat in a few weeks' time, see how things are going from there. So many thanks.
Tony, I'm just glad that you continue to listen to these crazed and rambling musings. Really. Anyway, great to speak to you. Let's do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Bye.